Junior cultural attaché Daniel Forrest reviewed his notes for the third time, trying to commit Valtrian's seasonal protocols to memory before the Queen's court began. He was supposed to observe, document, and remain completely invisible. Standard assignment for someone 6 months out of diplomatic training and catastrophically inexperienced. The seasonal court was a formal gathering where hundreds of Valtrian nobility celebrated the changing of their planet's long seasons. And Daniel's job was to understand the rituals enough to brief Earth's diplomatic corps later. The seating arrangement was rigidly hierarchical. Queen Elthara would occupy her crystalline throne on the elevated dais. High nobility in the first tier of seats, arranged by bloodline proximity to the throne. Minor nobility in the second tier. Diplomatic observers like Daniel relegated to the back where they could watch without disrupting the ceremony's careful choreography. Except when Daniel arrived at the Great Hall, a Valtrian protocol officer intercepted him at the entrance. The protocol officer, tall, imposing, with those distinctive long ears that marked his species, consulted a datapad and spoke with absolute certainty. Cultural attaché Daniel Forrest, you have been reassigned. The Queen has requested your presence. You will sit beside her throne during the feast. Daniel blinked. I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. I'm supposed to observe from. There is no mistake. Her Majesty Queen Elthara specifically requested you by name. The seat beside the throne has been prepared. Please follow me. Daniel followed in a daze of confusion and mounting terror. The seat beside the throne had been empty for 3 years, since Queen Elthara's consort died, and was traditionally reserved for someone of immense importance. Daniel was nobody, lowest rank in the diplomatic mission. He'd met the Queen exactly once, at a minor trade reception where he'd made awkward small talk about human agricultural exports for approximately 90 seconds. The Great Hall fell silent as Daniel was escorted down the center aisle. 300 Valtrian nobles turned to watch with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed scandal. Daniel's diplomatic training screamed warnings about protocols he was violating simply by approaching the dais, but the protocol officer was insistent. Queen Elthara sat on her throne, her long, elegant ears adorned with seasonal jewels that caught the light. When Daniel was seated in the chair beside her, a chair that felt impossibly presumptuous, she turned, acknowledged him with a slight nod, and spoke quietly. Thank you for joining me, Attaché Forrest. I hope the evening proves educational. Then she returned her attention to the ceremony, as if seating a junior human diplomat beside the throne was completely normal. Daniel sat rigid with terror, his heart pounding, while the entire court whispered and stared. The feast proceeded with formal precision. 7 courses, each representing different aspects of the season, served with elaborate ceremony. Musicians played traditional compositions. Nobles offered toasts with carefully practiced speeches. Daniel ate mechanically, hyper-aware of every movement, certain he was committing a dozen cultural violations he didn't understand. Queen Elthara occasionally spoke to him, quiet comments that only he could hear over the music and conversation filling the hall. The third course represents the transition between seasons. The bitter herbs symbolize what we leave behind, while the sweet fruit anticipates what approaches. This musical piece is 1,200 years old. My grandmother used to say it sounded like the planet itself singing. The noble in the blue robes has been trying to catch my eye for 20 minutes. He wants to propose a trade agreement that would benefit his family immensely and mine not at all. Daniel responded carefully, aware that every word might be scrutinized. But Elthara's long ears were relaxed, her tone genuine, and gradually he realized she wasn't testing him or performing for the court. She was just talking, like a person having conversation rather than a queen issuing pronouncements. When she asked about human seasonal traditions, Daniel found himself describing Earth's much shorter seasons, the cultural celebrations around solstices and equinoxes, the way different regions marked time differently. Elthara listened with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions that showed she was actually engaged rather than just being polite. Your seasons are so brief, she observed. Hours last for what you would call years. Does the rapid change make it difficult to appreciate each one? Maybe, Daniel admitted. But it also means we're constantly aware of change. Nothing stays the same for long, so there's this underlying current of Impermanence, I guess. We know summer won't last, so we try to appreciate it while it's here. Something shifted in Elthara's expression. Her ears performed a complex movement that Daniel's briefing materials had said indicated recognition or deep understanding. Impermanence, she repeated quietly, and the need to appreciate what cannot last. She paused, then spoke even more softly. I find these formal ceremonies exhausting. The rigid protocols leave little room for genuine interaction. Every conversation is calculated, every gesture has meaning beyond itself, and I am constantly observed but rarely truly seen. Daniel thought about his own experience, the pressure to represent humanity perfectly, the fear of diplomatic mistakes, the isolation of being surrounded by people yet feeling fundamentally alone. I understand that, he said carefully. Not the queen part, obviously, but the being watched without being seen, having to measure every word for political implications, being surrounded by people and still feeling isolated. Elthara turned to look at him directly, and Daniel saw something in her amber eyes that had nothing to do with royalty and everything to do with someone recognizing shared experience. Yes, she said. Exactly that. The distance that power creates. Everyone maintains careful space, speaking words measured for impact rather than meaning. Her ears lowered slightly. It has been 3 years since I sat beside someone who simply talked rather than calculated every syllable. 3 years since my consort died, and this chair became empty, and everyone began treating me with even more careful formality than before. The feast continued around them, but their conversation became its own small world. Two people discussing loneliness and duty, and the weight of positions that left little room for authentic connection. Hours passed. The feast transitioned into traditional performances, musicians playing seasonal compositions, poets reciting verses about change and continuity, ceremonial dances that Daniel barely understood but found beautiful in their precise choreography. At some point, Elthara's hand came to rest on the armrest between their chairs. Daniel was hyper-aware of its proximity, her long fingers relaxed, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Every noble in the hall could see this positioning. Every gesture would be analyzed for meaning. Daniel kept his own hands carefully in his lap, terrified of accidentally touching her and causing some kind of interstellar incident. But Elthara seemed unconcerned with the positioning. She commented on the performances, asked Daniel's opinion about the poetry, which he couldn't understand but appreciated aesthetically, and shared stories about previous seasonal courts she'd attended as a child. When the final performance concluded, and nobles began standing to offer formal thanks to the queen, a ritual that would take another hour easily, Daniel realized he should leave. He'd already overstayed whatever inexplicable welcome had brought him to this seat. Protocol demanded he excuse himself, return to appropriate distance, stop occupying a chair meant for someone far more important than a junior cultural attaché. He shifted forward in his seat, preparing the formal words for departure that his briefing had taught him. Elthara's hand moved faster than Daniel could process. Her long fingers wrapped around his, not grabbing but holding, gentle pressure that stopped his movement completely. "Don't leave," she said quietly, and her voice held something that made Daniel's heart stop. Not command, not royal decree, something closer to request, plea, vulnerability that queens weren't supposed to show. The hall went absolutely silent. Every noble who'd been preparing to approach the throne froze. Courtiers who'd been whispering among themselves stopped mid-conversation. Even the musicians seemed to hold their breath. Elthara's hand remained on Daniel's. Her amber eyes held his with intensity that had nothing to do with political calculation and everything to do with human or Valtrian need for connection. "Please," she added, barely above a whisper. "Everyone leaves. Protocol demands it, formality requires it, and I understand the necessity. Maintaining proper distance, respecting hierarchies, following the careful dance of court politics." Her ears lowered in what Daniel's briefing had said indicated sadness or resignation. "But just this once, I would like someone to stay. Not because duty demands it, not because position requires it, simply because they want to. Because the conversation was real and the connection felt genuine, and for a few hours I was not just queen being observed, but Elthara talking with Daniel." Daniel was frozen, acutely aware of 300 Valtrian nobles watching this moment, of the massive breach in protocol his continued presence represented, of how his choice would be discussed, analyzed, and potentially create diplomatic complications for months. He should politely decline, excuse himself with appropriate formality, restore proper distance between junior attaché and reigning monarch. That's what his training demanded, what protocol required, what political calculation suggested. But Elthara's hand was warm on his, and her expression held hope and loneliness in equal measure. And Daniel realized with absolute clarity that the diplomatic consequences mattered less than this profoundly human or species-transcendent moment of someone asking another person to stay. "I want to stay," Daniel said quietly and settled back into the chair. The hall erupted in barely suppressed reactions, gasps, whispers, shocked exchanges between nobles. The protocol officer, who'd escorted Daniel to the dais earlier, looked like he was reconsidering every life choice that had led to this moment. But Elthara's long ears lifted in what Daniel had learned meant profound relief. Her hand squeezed his briefly before releasing, and when she spoke, her voice held emotion that made Daniel understand how rare this must be. A queen asking someone to stay, and having them actually stay not because duty compelled it, but because they chose it. "Thank you," she said, and those two words carried more weight than any formal pronouncement Daniel had heard. The rest of the evening transformed. With Daniel still beside her, this human who'd chosen to stay when protocol said to leave, Elthara addressed the approaching nobles with warmth that transcended her usual formal courtesy. She spoke about seasonal change and community and the importance of genuine connection even in formal settings. She quoted poetry not just as ritual, but as personal expression. Nobles approached to offer their respects, and while they maintained proper formality toward Elthara, several studied Daniel with expressions ranging from curiosity to grudging respect. This human who the queen had asked to stay, who had stayed not from obligation, but choice, who had somehow become part of a moment that the court would discuss for years. When the court finally concluded hours later, far later than traditional seasonal courts typically ran, Elthara did something queens don't do. She walked Daniel to the palace entrance personally. "You didn't have to stay," she said, her long ears forward in earnest attention. "The political complications your choice will create, the scrutiny you'll face from both Valtrian nobles and your own diplomatic corps, you knew those consequences and stayed anyway." "You asked me to," Daniel replied simply. Not as queen commanding her subject, but as Elthara asking Daniel. That seemed more important than protocol. Something in her expressions softened, vulnerability and gratitude mixing with what might have been affection. Most people see the crown and cannot see past it. Titles, position, power, these things create distance that feels insurmountable. But you saw me. You talked to me like a person, not a position. And when I asked you to stay, when I showed vulnerability that queens are not supposed to show, you chose connection over calculation. "Why me?" Daniel asked. "Why request that I sit beside you? I'm nobody. Lowest rank in the diplomatic mission. There were hundreds of more appropriate choices." Elthara's ears performed that complex movement of recognition. "Because 2 months ago, at that minor trade reception, you were the only being in the room who didn't adjust their behavior when I entered. Everyone else stopped mid-conversation, adopted formal posture, measured their words. You were discussing human music with a Valtrian merchant and simply continued your conversation, only pausing to nod polite acknowledgement before returning to your topic." She smiled slightly. "You treated my presence as normal rather than disruptive. That was the first genuine moment I'd witnessed in months. My supervisor said I was too informal," Daniel admitted, "that I needed to work on proper diplomatic bearing. Your supervisor was wrong. Your informal genuineness is exactly what I needed." Elthara paused at the entrance. "Can we do this again? Not the formal court, just conversation. Two people talking without 300 nobles watching and analyzing every word." Daniel thought about the complications this would create, the scrutiny they'd both face, the diplomatic implications. Then he thought about Elthara asking him to stay, about choosing connection over protocol, about how that choice had felt more right than any political calculation. "Yes," he said, "despite the complications, despite the scrutiny, despite every logical reason why this is diplomatically complicated. Yes, because a few hours of genuine conversation with someone who sees you as a person rather than a position is worth more than a lifetime of perfect protocol. Elthara's ears lifted in that expression of profound relief. Thank you, Daniel, for staying, for choosing connection, for seeing Elthara instead of only seeing Queen. Years later, historians would document the unprecedented